of more than a dozen notorious biker gang members from Raleigh and Fayetteville.
Clubs dare to challenge the Hells Angels and live to tell the tale. With their vast criminal empire, brutal reputation, and a willingness to destroy anyone who stands in their way, the Angels have spent decades eliminating rivals and cementing their dominance. But not every enemy backed down. Some clubs fought back, and some nearly brought the Hells Angels to their knees. These weren't just rival gangs, they were full-scale threats, and today we're breaking down the most dangerous enemies the Hells Angels have ever faced. Number 20, Outlaws Motorcycle Club. The war between the Hells Angels and the Outlaws was one of the most brutal power struggles in biker history. The conflict can be traced back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the Hells Angels sought to expand into Canada, targeting Quebec as a key stronghold. Their takeover of the Popeyes Motorcycle Club in Montreal gave them a firm foothold, but the Outlaws had their own ambitions, setting up in Ontario and backing rival clubs like Satan's Choice and the Devil's Disciples. By the mid-1970s, the war had escalated into a brutal campaign of assassinations, bombings, and ambushes. One of the Hells Angels' deadliest weapons was Yves Trudeau, a Popeyes member turned elite hitman, responsible for eliminating numerous outlaws and their allies. The violence peaked in 1978, when two outlaws provocatively entered a Montreal bar known as an Angels Hangout. After being ejected, they lingered outside, taunting the club, until a car pulled up and Trudeau opened fire, unaliving one and critically wounding the other. From that moment, the Hells Angels unleashed a ruthless offensive. Bombs detonated under outlaws' cars, gunmen stormed clubhouses, and drive-by shootings became an almost daily occurrence. A high-ranking outlaw was assassinated in broad daylight with a car bomb, sending the message that nowhere was safe. The outlaws struggled to mount a defense, and for 3 months they were on the back foot, losing members and territory at an alarming rate. Their chance at retaliation came on May 12, 1978, when an Angels member was grazed by a bullet in a drive-by shooting. But it was too little, too late. By the early 1980s, the Outlaws had been bled dry in Quebec, unable to match the relentless assault from the Hells Angels. Under the leadership of Yves Le Boss Buteau, the Angels emerged victorious. But their triumph wasn't without consequence. In 1983, Buteau was assassinated by an Outlaws associate in a shocking public attack. Rather than turning the tide, this move only sealed the Outlaws' fate. The Angels retaliated with a series of calculated hits that crushed what was left of the Outlaws' leadership. By 1984, the Outlaws had retreated entirely from Quebec, leaving the Hells Angels as the undisputed kings of the province's lucrative underworld. Number 19. The Booze Fighters. The Hells Angels have clashed with some of the most violent outlaw motorcycle clubs in history, but one of their earliest enemies wasn't a criminal empire. It was a club built on brotherhood, booze, and rebellion. The Booze Fighters Motorcycle Club, founded in 1946 in California, never intended to be an outlaw club. They were rebels. They were made up of World War II veterans, tough men looking for freedom on the open road, and they had no interest in bowing to anyone, especially not the Hells Angels. Their wild reputation didn't sit well with the Angels, who were looking to dominate the California biker scene. Tensions between the two clubs exploded in the late 1940s and early 1950s, in an era when motorcycle culture was still lawless. The infamous Hollister riot of 1947, where booze fighters turned a sleepy California town into a chaotic biker party. By the mid-1950s, the Hells Angels had grown into a serious force, taking over territory, forcing smaller clubs to patch over, and crushing those who resisted. The booze fighters refused to be absorbed. What started as bar fights turned into all-out brawls, with fists and bottles giving way to knives, chains, and ambushes on the highways. The booze fighters were war-hardened fighters, but the Angels fought dirty, using brutality and intimidation to tip the scales. The booze fighters had a choice: escalate into an all-out war or step back from the growing outlaw scene. They chose the latter. Unlike the Hells Angels, they never wanted to be a criminal powerhouse. Today, the booze fighters remain a respected name in motorcycle culture, representing the original rebellious spirit of post-war bikers. But the Angels weren't done proving their dominance. Next, they set their sights on a club that refused to play by their rules. Number 18. Mongols Motorcycle Club. What began as a territorial dispute exploded into a decades-long blood feud marked by shootouts, bombings, and relentless retaliation. The Mongols Motorcycle Club secured their place as the Hells Angels' most dangerous enemy in 1977 when they seized control of Southern California, a region the Hells Angels had dominated for years. Forced to retreat to Northern California, the Angels never forgave the insult. As the Mongols expanded into the Bay Area, the Pacific Northwest, and Canada, the Angels saw it as an all-out challenge to their supremacy. Both clubs responded by recruiting heavily, even bringing in street gang members to bolster their ranks. The battle evolved from a turf war into a full-scale struggle for control over the criminal underworld, with both sides fighting for dominance in drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and power. Tensions reached a boiling point in 2002 at the Laughlin River Run, leading to one of the most infamous biker clashes in history, the River Run Riot. The annual Nevada gathering was meant to be a celebration of motorcycle culture, but that year it turned into a bloodbath. A false tip from a police officer led Hells Angels members to believe their brothers were in danger inside Harrah's casino. Acting without hesitation, they stormed the building and confronted the Mongols. Within seconds, gunfire erupted, knives slashed, and chaos overtook the casino floor. Mongol Anthony Barrera was fatally stabbed, while Hells Angels Jeremy Bell and Robert Tumulty were shot and passed away. The clash left 3 dead, a dozen injured, and the casino floor covered in blood. The first time multiple people had been unalived inside a Nevada casino. The aftermath saw 7 Hells Angels and 6 Mongols sentenced to prison, while 36 others had charges dropped. But even with convictions, the war didn't end. The Mongols grew stronger, pushing further into Angels territory. The battle, once confined to California, spread across multiple states and even beyond US borders. The Mongols had transformed into a global force, one that the Hells Angels could no longer ignore. Unlike other clubs the Angels have crushed, the Mongols only grew stronger, cementing their place as one of the most dangerous threats the Hells Angels have ever faced. But if the Hells Angels thought their war with the Mongols was brutal, their next enemy would take violence to another level. Number 17. Pagans Motorcycle Club. The rivalry between the Pagans and the Hells Angels has been a relentless war for dominance, with neither side willing to back down. While the Pagans lack the international reach of the Angels, they are one of the most violent and unpredictable enemies the club has ever faced. The Pagans, founded in 1959 in Maryland, quickly became a powerhouse on the East Coast, controlling the meth trade and forming alliances with the Bloods, the Philadelphia Mob, and the Latin Kings. But they always had a weakness: numbers. Unlike the Hells Angels, they remained mostly regional. When law enforcement cracked down in the early 2000s, jailing over 70 members, including national leaders, the Angels saw an opportunity. They invaded the Pagans' stronghold in Philadelphia, attempting to wipe them out. The first major strike was a botched assassination attempt on Philadelphia chapter president Steve "Gorilla" Mandin, who miraculously survived being shot 9 times. With their target still breathing, the Angels flipped Thomas "Thinker" Wood, Mandin's second in command. His defection was an unforgivable betrayal, and the Pagans had to respond. Their revenge came on February 23, 2002, when over 70 Pagans stormed the Hellraiser Ball, a Hells Angels event in Plainview, New York. Armed with knives, bats, and axes, they tore through the venue, smashing exhibits and attacking rivals. The Angels fought back, and within minutes, Raymond Dwyer opened fire, unaliving 1 Pagan and wounding 5 others. Chaos ensued, with 73 bikers arrested in one of the biggest mass arrests in biker history. The war escalated further when Thinker Wood was shot on Interstate 76 shortly after his defection. Though his passing remains unsolved, few doubt the Pagans were behind it. Over the years, the club adapted, launching the Blue Wave Initiative in the mid-2000s and 10s, a massive recruitment drive to expand into Hells Angels territory. By 2021, they had opened over 30 new chapters, signaling that the war was far from over. The rivalry reignited on May 2022, when over 100 Hells Angels rode into Fall River, Massachusetts, a Pagan stronghold. a faction of 40 angels broke off and attacked the Pagans clubhouse, leading to a brutal street fight. By the time police arrived, 7 bikers were hospitalized. The clubhouse was shut down, and 2 months later, the FBI raided Hells Angels properties across the state. For now, law enforcement has suppressed major conflicts, but no one believes the war is over. But while the Pagans fought for survival on the East Coast, another enemy in Quebec was waging a war so brutal it would leave the entire province in fear. Number 16. Rock Machine Motorcycle Club. The war between the Hells Angels and Rock Machine MC nearly tore Quebec apart. What started as a dispute over drug distribution spiraled into a years-long bloodbath, with bombings, assassinations, and public unalivings, leaving over 160 dead and 200 injured. By the early 1990s, the Hells Angels dominated the province's drug trade, backed by the Montreal Mafia and a network of puppet clubs. But their expansion was blocked by Salvatore Cazzetta, who controlled a powerful criminal network. In 1994, Cazzetta was arrested in Florida, leaving a power vacuum that Maurice Mom Boucher of the Hells Angels sought to exploit. He ordered all Montreal drug dealers to buy exclusively from the Angels, or die. But the Rock Machine, led by Giovanni Cazzetta, refused to bow. On July 13, 1994, the war erupted when Rock Machine gunmen shot a Hells Angels-affiliated Death Riders member. The next day, another Angel was gunned down. What followed was an explosion of violence, over 80 bombings, 130 arson cases, and at least 20 disappearances. One of the most shocking moments came on August 9, 1995, when a car bomb unalived Mark Dube in a residential area. The explosion sent shrapnel flying, striking 11-year-old Daniel Desrochers, sparking public outrage. By 2001, after Operation Springtime, hundreds of bikers were arrested, including Boucher, dismantling the Rock Machine. Some members joined the Bandidos, but after the Shedden massacre in 2006, they were effectively wiped out. The war left Montreal scarred, proving that in the world of outlaw bikers, no enemy is ever truly gone, only waiting for a chance to rise again. But while the Rock Machine War left Montreal in ruins, the Sons of Silence were proving that even in the Midwest, the Hells Angels would face enemies who refused to be crushed. Number 15. The Sons of Silence. The war between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence began as a struggle for control over key drug routes and escalated into a brutal conflict. The Sons of Silence, founded in Colorado in 1966 by Bruce Gale, the Colonel Richardson, were smaller but fiercely loyal and well organized. Unlike other clubs that the Angels had absorbed or destroyed, the Sons of Silence refused to submit. As the Angels expanded into the Midwest, the Sons of Silence resisted, triggering a war that would span multiple states. Violence erupted across the country, with bombings and arson attacks targeting clubhouses on both sides. Sons of Silence members ambushed Hells Angels gatherings, forcing brutal retaliations. The conflict wasn't limited to back roads or secluded biker bars. These attacks played out in broad daylight, in public spaces, with innocent bystanders caught in the chaos. The Sons of Silence proved they could match the Angels' aggression, striking back with calculated ferocity. The war reached its peak when street battles and drive-by shootings became regular occurrences. In one particularly violent exchange, bikers engaged in a full-scale gunfight in a busy city street, leaving multiple casualties. Law enforcement, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the violence, launched aggressive crackdowns, raiding clubhouses and making mass arrests. Eventually, the war took its toll. The Hells Angels, facing mounting law enforcement scrutiny and struggling to maintain control in the region, realized that prolonged conflict was unsustainable. While the open warfare subsided, tensions between the clubs never fully disappeared. Just as the Sons of Silence held their ground in the Midwest, the Vagos were about to prove that even in the Hells Angels' own backyard, there were rivals bold enough to challenge their rule. Number 14. Vagos Motorcycle Club. Vagos Motorcycle Club, formed in the 1960s, had no intention of bowing to the Hells Angels, and their defiance led to decades of bloodshed across multiple states. The Angels had long ruled California's outlaw biker world, but in San Bernardino, a new force was rising, the Vagos. Determined to carve out their own empire, they expanded rapidly, bringing them into direct conflict with the Angels. By the 2000s, both clubs were targeted by law enforcement in massive undercover operations. But rather than slowing the war, the pressure only made it more brutal. In 2010, the long-simmering rivalry erupted in Santa Cruz, California, traditionally Hells Angels territory. When Vagos members rode into town looking for a fight, a chase through the streets ended in a violent confrontation, but that was just the beginning. In 2011, the war reached its most infamous moment inside the Nugget Casino in Sparks, Nevada. When members from both clubs crossed paths, a brawl erupted, and Vagos member Ernesto Gonzalez pulled a gun, assassinating Hells Angels leader Jeffrey Pettigrew in front of stunned onlookers. Pettigrew was a club legend, and his death triggered an immediate wave of retaliation. Even within the Angels, the war caused fractures. At Pettigrew's funeral, an internal dispute turned deadly when one member shot another in an argument over the club's response. Meanwhile, the Vagos braced for the inevitable counterattack. By 2022, tensions reignited in a shocking way. During a Vagos memorial ride in Nevada, 3 Hells Angels ambushed them on a remote highway, opening fire. Despite arrests and law enforcement crackdowns, the conflict between the Hells Angels and the Vagos remains one of the most dangerous rivalries in outlaw biker history. As the war between the Hells Angels and the Vagos raged on in the United States, across the Atlantic, an even deadlier conflict was brewing, one that would turn Scandinavia into a battleground. Number 13. Bandidos Motorcycle Club. The roots of the Great Nordic Biker War trace back to the 1980s when the Hells Angels established their first Scandinavian chapter. Their rapid expansion threatened smaller clubs, some of which aligned with the Bandidos MC. In 1993, the Undertaker's MC patched over to become Bandidos Denmark, putting the two clubs on a collision course. The conflict exploded in 1994 when the Hells Angels tried to suppress the growth of the Morbids MC, a Swedish club backed by the Bandidos. The first major casualty came in February 1994 when Hells Angels member Joachim Bowman was unalived in a shootout. Days later, the Angels clubhouse in Helsingborg was hit with an anti-tank rocket. The violence escalated as Bandidos allies in Finland gunned down a Hells Angels-aligned club president in June 1994, followed by a shootout in Oslo in February 1995. Unlike typical biker wars, this conflict saw both sides using military-grade weapons. The Hells Angels struck back in July 1995, unaliving Bandidos Sweden president Michael Joe Ljunggren. The Bandidos retaliated with coordinated rocket attacks on Hells Angels properties. On Christmas Day 1995, a brawl in Denmark escalated tensions further. By March 1996, the violence spread to major airports. Hells Angels ambushed Bandidos at Oslo and Copenhagen airports, unaliving one and injuring 3 others. That July, a Hells Angels member shot and unalived a Danish Bandido in Oslo, triggering more revenge attacks. The bombings reached a peak in October 1996 when 3 separate Hells Angels clubhouses were attacked. A blast in Malmö injured 12 spectators, while another in Copenhagen hit a clubhouse during a party. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, including Irene Astrid Bakervold, who was unalived in June 1997 when her car exploded outside a Bandidos clubhouse. By September 25, 1997, after 11 deaths and nearly 100 injuries, both clubs agreed to a truce. But the peace was short-lived. By the early 2000s, both clubs had expanded further into Scandinavia, keeping their rivalry alive. To this day, whenever the Hells Angels and Bandidos cross paths, violence is never far behind. Just as the Hells Angels were battling for control in Scandinavia, another brutal war was unfolding in Australia. Number 12. Comanchero Motorcycle Club. The conflict between the Hells Angels and the Comanchero Motorcycle Club has shaped the landscape of organized crime in Australia. The Comanchero, founded in 1966 by former soldier William Jock Ross, quickly became one of Australia's most feared biker gangs. Ross ruled with military-style discipline, but his harsh leadership led to internal fractures. In 1983, a faction defected to form the country's first Bandidos chapter, leading to the Milpera massacre, a shootout that left 7 dead, including an innocent 14-year-old girl. By the 1970s, the Hells Angels had expanded into Australia, but they faced resistance from clubs like the Comanchero. The two clubs clashed multiple times, but the war escalated in 2009 with the Sydney airport brawl. Members from both clubs were on the same flight from Melbourne to Sydney, and when they landed, tensions erupted into an all-out fight. In front of horrified travelers, bikers wielded metal bollards and turned the terminal into a battlefield. Hells Angels associate Anthony Zervas was beaten, marking one of the most high-profile unalivings in the feud. Mick Howie, the Comanchero leader involved in the airport brawl, was later convicted of physical harm, but his imprisonment didn't stop the violence. Upon his release, tensions continued to rise. Then, in 2018, Howie was shot in a drive-by while sitting in his luxury car outside a Sydney gym. The battle intensified again in 2013 during the Broadbeach Brawl, a massive street fight involving the Comanchero, Bandidos, and other outlaw clubs. The chaos led to one of the biggest crackdowns in Australian history, with stricter laws targeting biker gangs. But despite government efforts, the war has continued through drive-by shootings, firebombings, and targeted assassinations, as both clubs fight for control of the lucrative drug trade. In 2020, the sniper-style assassination of former Rebels president Nick Martin at a public event highlighted just how brutal and sophisticated these gang wars had become. While a special forces-trained hitman was arrested for the unaliving, authorities believe it was linked to the Comanchero MC. With over 3,500 patched bikers across 35 outlaw motorcycle clubs, Australia remains a battleground for biker wars. Unlike North America and Europe, where the Hells Angels dominate, Australian outlaw clubs continue to resist. But in the battle against this next enemy, even innocent bystanders became collateral damage. Number 11, Finks Motorcycle Club. One of its most tragic casualties of the war between the Hells Angels and the Finks Motorcycle Club was Jason de Yeso, an innocent man caught in the crossfire of a deadly power struggle. His 2012 unaliving was the culmination of an escalating war between the two clubs, a conflict that has pushed both sides to extreme lengths in their fight for control. The Finks have long been one of Australia's most defiant outlaw clubs, refusing to bow to the Hells Angels' dominance. While other clubs have been crushed or absorbed, the Finks have held their ground, expanding their numbers and fighting back with firebombings, drive-by shootings, and brutal ambushes. Their resistance has led to years of bloodshed, with both clubs locked in a vicious cycle of revenge. By late 2012, the war escalated when the home of the Alzuain family, alleged Hells Angels members, was firebombed, a move that demanded immediate retaliation. Seeking revenge, a group of Hells Angels and their associates stormed a tattoo parlor owned by Finks member Charles Bonici. They trashed the shop, mistreated employees, and made it clear they were out for blood. But Bonici had already fled. Tracking him down, the gang arrived at a workshop in Puraka, expecting to find him. Instead, they found Jason de Yeso, a completely innocent bystander. In broad daylight, the men walked up to the workshop's roller door, pulled out their weapons, and opened fire. De Yeso, who had stepped outside, was shot at point-blank range with a sawn-off shotgun. Employees inside the shop scrambled for safety as gunfire tore through the building. Law enforcement launched an extensive investigation, leading to the arrest of 8 men linked to the Hells Angels. Prosecutors revealed that De Yeso's passing was not random. It was part of a calculated war between the Finks and the Hells Angels. Years after De Yeso's passing, tensions between the two clubs remain high. The streets of Australia remain a battleground, and as long as both clubs exist, the fight for supremacy will never be over. But this next enemy didn't just fight back. They were going to turn the streets into a war zone. Number 10, the Rebels, are the country's largest outlaw motorcycle club, expanding into Europe, Southeast Asia, and New Zealand. Unlike other clubs that either folded or submitted to the Hells Angels, the Rebels have continuously pushed back. One of the most high-profile disputes erupted in Scarborough, Perth, over control of lucrative businesses, including a tattoo parlor. Former Rebels boss Nick Martin sought to expand the club's presence, but the Hells Angels, who already claimed the area, weren't about to share. A confrontation between Martin and Dane Brockovich, the Hells Angels' sergeant-at-arms, escalated into an all-out brawl, igniting a new wave of violence. Just weeks later, on December 12, 2020, Nick Martin was assassinated at a Perth drag racing event in front of a massive crowd. A sniper, later revealed to be a highly trained ex-Special Forces soldier, took the shot from 300 meters away, with the bullet passing through Martin and injuring an 8-year-old boy. The $300,000 contract was reportedly ordered by Comanchero MC associate David James Pye. While the shooter was caught, his cooperation with law enforcement led to even more fallout among the clubs. Authorities immediately suspected the Hells Angels, as Martin's growing influence threatened their stronghold in key territories. His death was one of the most high-profile assassinations in outlaw biker history. Shootings, bombings, and brutal ambushes followed as both clubs sought revenge, turning Australia into a battleground. This wasn't the first time the rebels had gone head-to-head with the Hells Angels, and it wouldn't be the last. Both clubs have expanded globally, taking their rivalry beyond Australia's borders. In response to the escalating violence, Australian authorities launched one of the largest crackdowns on outlaw clubs in history. Police targeted the rebels, Hells Angels, and other clubs, raiding clubhouses, seizing weapons, and making mass arrests. The government introduced anti-biker laws, making it illegal for club members to gather in public or wear colours. But despite the legal pressure, the war continued underground. Unlike many clubs that have been dismantled or forced into submission, the rebels have held their ground, refusing to be pushed out of Australia's outlaw hierarchy. But the next war wouldn't just end at dominance, it was going to bring about complete annihilation. Number 9. Bullshit Motorcycle Club. From 1977 to 1988, the Hells Angels and Bullshit MC waged an all-out war for dominance, leaving 12 dead and countless wounded. This was a war over territory and power, with Christiania, Copenhagen's lawless hashish market, at the center of the fight. By the late 1970s, Denmark's biker scene was chaotic, filled with brawling gangs with no real structure. That changed when Bullshit MC emerged from a merger between the Nørrebro gang and Filthy Few. They quickly became notorious for their brutality, refusing to submit to any other club. Meanwhile, a rival faction known as the Union was making moves of its own. After a meeting with the Hells Angels in Europe, the Union transformed into Hells Angels Denmark, the first Scandinavian chapter of the world's most powerful outlaw club. Denmark wasn't big enough for two dominant forces, and violence erupted almost immediately. In 1977, Bullshit MC member Kim Mortensen passed away in a shootout with the Nomads, a club that later merged with the Hells Angels. Days later, his best friend Johnny Jensen was gunned down in retaliation. Between 1979 and 1988, the conflict escalated into near-constant shootouts, bombings, and ambushes. Both clubs were out for blood, determined to wipe the other off the map. The most pivotal moment came in 1983, when 3 Bullshit MC members walked into a restaurant deep in Hells Angels territory. They were immediately ambushed by 4 Hells Angels. 2 passed away on the spot, an event the media labeled a tragedy. Retribution came swiftly. Months later, Bullshit MC attacked a Hells Angels clubhouse, triggering even more bloodshed. But by then, the Hells Angels had a plan. They would eliminate Bullshit MC's leadership. The man for the job, Jørn Junker Nielsen, a ruthless Hells Angels enforcer. He waited outside the Bullshit president's house and unalived him in a hail of bullets. With their leader dead, Bullshit MC fell into disarray. A new president stepped up, but in 1985, he was gunned down in a bar just before Christmas. It was now clear the Hells Angels were eradicating their enemies. By 1988, Bullshit MC was crumbling. Their members were either dead, jailed, or defecting. On July 1, 1988, their final president, Jan Kroh Lindegaard, called the Hells Angels headquarters and surrendered. And with that, the Hells Angels emerged as the undisputed rulers of Denmark. Bullshit MC may have been destroyed, but for over a decade they stood toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful outlaw clubs in the world. This war was over, but the next one would take violence to an entirely new level, where even rooftops became battlegrounds. Number 8. Gypsy Joker's Motorcycle Club. Some rivalries stay hidden in the shadows, others explode into all-out war. And when it came to the Hells Angels versus the Gypsy Jokers, things got so violent that snipers were stationed on rooftops, waiting for the next enemy to step into their sights. The streets became battlegrounds, clubhouses were stormed, and hospitals filled with wounded bikers. The Gypsy Jokers were one of the few brave or reckless enough to take on the Hells Angels directly. And for years, they didn't back down. The Gypsy Jokers had been a fearsome force since the early 1960s, with chapters across the West Coast and Australia. They were ruthless, fiercely loyal, and always ready for a fight. And in those days, one name stood out: Phil Cross. A Navy veteran, a martial artist, and a natural-born fighter, Cross was looking for a brotherhood as intense as he was. He bounced between clubs, briefly riding with a fake Hells Angels chapter, then the Night Riders, before finding a home with the Gypsy Jokers. But by the time he joined, the club was already locked in an all-out war with the real Hells Angels. It was street fights, clubhouse raids, and brutal ambushes. The Jokers didn't just fight back, they set up snipers on rooftops, ready to pick off any Hells Angel who got too close. But the Angels weren't the type to be intimidated. They kept coming, and the violence escalated to new extremes. For Phil Cross, the war was personal. He was in the middle of it all, fighting in brutal brawls, taking out enemies with his bare hands, and ending up in the ER more times than he could count. But as the Angels kept growing, the Jokers were constantly on the defensive. Outnumbered and outgunned, Cross realized this war couldn't be won. So he made a move no one expected. He switched sides. Instead of going down with the Jokers, Cross and most of his brothers patched over to the Hells Angels, forming the San Jose chapter, the same club they had fought against for years. It was the ultimate power shift. The Gypsy Jokers survived, especially in Australia, where they became one of the dominant outlaw motorcycle clubs. But for a brief, brutal moment, they made the Hells Angels bleed. The Gypsy Jokers put up a fight, but the next club came closer than anyone to keeping the Hells Angels out of Canada for good. Number 7. Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club. Most rival clubs folded under the pressure of the Hells Angels' global dominance. But one club nearly beat the Angels at their own game. For years, Satan's Choice ruled Canada, growing into the second-largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world, right behind the Hells Angels themselves. At their peak, they had over 400 members and controlled Ontario's streets like an empire. But when the Hells Angels set their sights on Ontario, they expected an easy takeover. Instead, they ran straight into one of their most dangerous enemies north of the border. Satan's Choice had already survived wars with the Popeyes and the Outlaws, fought off police crackdowns, and battled their own internal betrayals, all while building one of the most powerful drug networks in Canada. Founded in 1956 in Toronto, the club started as a rowdy group of bikers, but everything changed when Bernie Guindon took over in the 1960s. Under his leadership, Satan's Choice became Canada's most feared motorcycle club. They ran drug labs, controlled smuggling routes, and even held influence over local politics. By the 1970s, they were second only to the Hells Angels worldwide, and that meant war was inevitable. The Hells Angels attempted to expand into Ontario in the 1970s, but Satan's Choice fought back, forming an alliance with the Outlaws to keep them out. For years, this kept the Angels locked out of Ontario, forcing them to focus their power in Quebec. By the 1990s, the Hells Angels changed tactics. Instead of a full-scale war, leader Walter Stadnik played the long game, waiting for cracks in Satan's Choice's leadership. As law enforcement pressure increased and the Outlaws weakened, members of Satan's Choice began reconsidering their future. On December 29, 2000, Satan's Choice officially merged with the Hells Angels, bringing 160 members into the fold overnight. Just like that, Canada's greatest threat to the Hells Angels became part of their ranks. Some Satan's Choice members never adapted, and in 2017, a failed attempt to revive the club was quickly shut down. In the end, the Hells Angels won. Satan's Choice may have fallen, but the next club never did. no matter how hard the Hells Angels tried. Number 6. The Highwaymen. The Highwaymen Motorcycle Club has spent decades locked in a brutal power struggle against the Hells Angels, both trying to dominate the criminal underworld of the Midwest. The Angels want absolute control, and the Highwaymen are the one club that has consistently stood in their way. Founded in Detroit, 1954, the Highwaymen are Michigan's largest and oldest outlaw club. Unlike many clubs that fell under the Angels' influence, the Highwaymen built their own empire, running drug operations, extortion, and gun smuggling without outside interference. This independence made them a target. The Angels had long controlled the Midwest through sheer force, but Detroit was Highwayman territory, and they were ready to fight for it. Law enforcement reports have linked both clubs to bombings, ambushes, and targeted hits, as each side tried to gain the upper hand. The Highwaymen met the Angels' aggression with their own, cementing their reputation as one of the most fearless outlaw clubs in the country. They dug in, fortified their numbers, and fought back with a level of ferocity that caught even the Angels off guard. Despite their strength, the Highwaymen have faced intense pressure from both the Hells Angels and law enforcement. High-profile arrests, RICO cases, and federal crackdowns have weakened the club, but they still hold onto their stronghold. The Highwaymen may have held their ground in Detroit, but the next club proved just as relentless in defending its turf. Number 5. Iron Horsemen Motorcycle Club. The Iron Horsemen emerged from the Midwest, building a reputation as one of the most aggressive outlaw clubs in the country. With deep roots in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, they operate far from the Angels' West Coast stronghold, yet they have consistently been one of the biggest thorns in the Angels' side. In 1989, a shootout between the Iron Horsemen and the Outlaws ended with multiple casualties. The Hells Angels have tried to expand into Ohio and Kentucky, but the Iron Horsemen have fought them at every turn. These are two clubs that do not negotiate, do not back down, and do not forget old grudges. Law enforcement has documented their clashes, linking both clubs to organized crime, drug trafficking, and armed conflicts. But despite the heat, neither side has backed down. The Iron Horsemen are one of the few clubs that have never fallen in line under the Angels' influence, making them a constant target in the ongoing war for dominance. The Iron Horsemen have faced law enforcement crackdowns, internal betrayals, and relentless pressure from the Hells Angels. But their grit and willingness to fight have kept them standing. For the Hells Angels, eliminating rivals is part of the game. They absorb clubs or destroy them. But the Iron Horsemen remain one of the few clubs that have resisted both options, keeping their independence despite the constant threat of war. They stood their ground, but the next club took defiance to another level, refusing to be controlled no matter the cost. Number 4. The Grim Reapers. For the Hells Angels, most enemies either fall in line or fall apart. But the Grim Reapers Motorcycle Club refused to do either. Since their formation in 1965 in Louisville, Kentucky, the Grim Reapers built a reputation as fiercely independent and dangerously unpredictable. Despite being a second-tier club compared to the Big Four, their alliances, criminal operations, and defiant nature have put them at constant odds with the Hells Angels. And when these two clubs clash, it's anything but peaceful. From the start, the Grim Reapers never played by the rules, not the AMAs, not the laws, and certainly not the Hells Angels. Their three-piece patch, strict bylaws, and secretive initiation process made it clear they were more than just a social club. They carved out territory across Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Tennessee, and Iowa, securing strongholds that the Hells Angels wanted. Their alliance with the Outlaws MC, one of the Angels' most bitter enemies, made things even more explosive. But what truly set them on a collision course with the Hells Angels was their unwillingness to be controlled. As the Hells Angels expanded into the Midwest, they expected resistance, but the Grim Reapers weren't backing down. They were already entrenched in the drug trade, moving massive amounts of cocaine and methamphetamine. Their operations were pulling in millions, and they weren't about to hand over a piece of their empire. The territorial battles turned violent, and law enforcement took notice. But unlike many smaller clubs, the Grim Reapers had an advantage: their alliance with the Outlaws MC. Any attempt by the Hells Angels To muscle in on Reaper territory would mean fighting not just the Reapers, but the Outlaws as well. By the late 1990s, the war between the Grim Reapers and the Hells Angels had escalated into full-blown criminal warfare, with both clubs battling for drug distribution, stolen motorcycles, and weapons trafficking. Despite law enforcement crackdowns, leadership arrests, and constant pressure from the Hells Angels, the Grim Reapers never disappeared. They adapted, relocating, rebuilding, and staying under the radar. For the Hells Angels, dominance means taking over or eliminating their rivals. But the Grim Reapers have survived for decades, refusing to be absorbed or destroyed. But this next club actually went to war against the Angels alongside one of their most dangerous enemies. Number 3. The Diablos. Some clubs bow to the Hells Angels, others fear them. But the Diablos Motorcycle Club, they took a different route, one that led to an all-out war. Founded in 1999 in Thailand, the Diablos quickly became one of the most ruthless allies of the Bandidos, a club that has been at war with the Hells Angels for decades. And as a Bandidos support club, the Diablos didn't just inherit the rivalry, they lived it. From Australia to Europe, shootouts to brutal ambushes, the Diablos and the Hells Angels have left a bloody trail across the globe. Unlike the Hells Angels, who expand through brute force, the Diablos carved out their empire under the Bandidos' protection. As a puppet club, they serve as the Bandidos' enforcers, handling dirty work, recruiting fresh blood, and expanding territory. Their red and gold colors mirror the Bandidos, but the grinning devil on their patch sends a clear message. They aren't just followers, they're warriors. But there was one major problem. The Hells Angels weren't having it. When the Diablos' rapid expansion began taking over key Bandidos' strongholds, the Hells Angels saw them as a threat. And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. One of the most explosive clashes took place in Melbourne, Australia in 2013. The Hells Angels stormed the Diablos' clubhouse in Melton, attacking members and collecting ID details from their girlfriends at gunpoint. A clear warning. The Diablos barely had time to regroup before the Bandidos arrived for backup. But the Hells Angels were ready, ramming a car driven by Bandidos' National Sergeant-at-Arms Toby Mitchell and unleashing a barrage of 30 bullets. Mitchell was shot in the arm, and another Bandido was wounded. This was a declaration of war. The Diablos' expansion into Finland put them in the crosshairs of law enforcement and the Hells Angels. In 2012, Diablos member Timothy Stewart Robinson shot a man inside a restaurant in Oulu, just weeks after beating another victim with a baseball bat and an iron pipe. He was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, but the damage was done. The Diablos weren't just a support club anymore, they were a force of their own. With both clubs engaged in drug trafficking, extortion, and arms dealing, the Diablos' presence in Finland threatened the Angels' growing influence in Scandinavia. The Hells Angels retaliated not just with violence, but with political influence and legal attacks. In 2012, the Diablos' Heinsberg chapter in Germany was banned, alongside the local Bandidos chapter. By 2017, the German government outlawed Diablos patches nationwide. Despite crackdowns, police raids, and mass arrests, the Diablos refused to disappear. Their Swedish clubhouses became hotbeds of crime, with police uncovering amphetamines, weapons, and drug trafficking operations. Law enforcement saw them as a criminal empire, but to the Hells Angels, they were an enemy that refused to fall. Though this next outlaw gang didn't rely on allies, they built their own empire and went to war with the Hells Angels on their own terms. Number 2. The Warlocks Motorcycle Club. Outlaw biker clubs thrive on loyalty, power, and a ruthless grip over their turf. But when two clubs refuse to submit, violence is inevitable. For over 50 years, the Hells Angels and the Warlocks have been locked in one of the most brutal and relentless rivalries in outlaw history. With both clubs fighting for dominance, especially along the East Coast, their war has left behind a trail of bodies, burned-out clubhouses, and blood-soaked streets. The Angels may have had global infamy, but the Warlocks weren't the type to back down. And when both clubs wanted the same turf, there was only one way to settle it: through bullets, firebombs, and full-scale warfare. The Warlocks emerged in 1967 in Philadelphia, founded by ex-military men and hardened street bikers who didn't just embrace the outlaw lifestyle, they defined it. Built on drug trafficking, extortion, and violence, the club expanded aggressively throughout Pennsylvania, but their growth put them on a direct collision course with the Hells Angels, who already had their grip on the East Coast drug trade. The war erupted in 1974 when Warlocks members ambushed and beat a Hells Angel in Philadelphia over a territorial dispute. The Angels responded immediately, and from that moment, the Warlocks became sworn enemies. Over the next decade, their battles spread across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, with each club launching raid-style attacks, firebombing clubhouses, and leaving members for dead in barroom brawls. But things escalated further in the 1980s, when the Warlocks made a power move straight into Hells Angels territory. In 1980, 300 Warlocks stormed into New York, rolling deep through the streets as a direct challenge. The Angels answered back with stabbings, shootings, and firebombs, turning city streets into battlegrounds. The peak of the war came in 1988, when 4 Hells Angels kidnapped and nearly beat Warlocks leader Craig Goodknecht to death. When the Warlocks tried another intimidation run through New York, the Angels didn't wait. They opened fire, sending their rivals scrambling for cover. By the 1990s, the war had reached a level of pure brutality. In 1994, Warlocks associate Paul Castellano was unalived in Philadelphia. A warning shot from the Angels that they weren't backing down. Instead, the Warlocks ramped up their attacks, leading to a string of unaliving attempts, brawls, and a deadly gunfight at a 2003 motorcycle show in New Jersey. One Hells Angel was unalived after firing on 3 Warlocks, proving that neither side was willing to let this war end. Even prison walls couldn't contain the violence. In Rhode Island's maximum security prison, 2 high-ranking leaders nearly hurt each other to death in the yard, proving their hatred went far beyond the streets. But outside, the war was still raging. In 2015, a Pennsylvania campground turned into a war zone, leaving 1 man paralyzed and several others wounded after yet another shootout. Then came 2021, when Warlocks leader David Dresser Jackiela was assassinated outside the Warlocks clubhouse in Philadelphia. Authorities immediately suspected the Hells Angels, a final act of revenge in a war that had already claimed so many lives. For 5 decades, the Hells Angels and the Warlocks have been at war, leaving behind death, destruction, and an unbreakable cycle of revenge. The Warlocks' war with the Hells Angels left a trail of destruction, but another enemy would take the fight even further, turning Australia into a battlefield where no one was safe. Number 1. The Nomads Motorcycle Club. The Hells Angels have built their empire on power, control, and crushing anyone who stands in their way. But few clubs have resisted them with the ferocity of the Nomads Motorcycle Club. Founded in Newcastle, Australia in 1968, the Nomads weren't just another outlaw crew. They were an unpredictable, fiercely independent force. They didn't answer to anyone, and when the Hells Angels tried to exert their influence, it set off one of the most volatile biker wars in Australian history. Unlike most outlaw clubs, the Nomads operated independently, making them hard to control and even harder to take down. But in 2009, everything changed. Scott Orrock, the Nomads' national president, defected to the Hells Angels, taking several members with him. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was an act of war. The very next day, Orrock's Toyota Sora was torched, a clear message that the Nomads weren't going to let his actions go unpunished. The war that followed would shake the Australian biker underworld to its core. Within months, gunmen in balaclavas stormed the Nomads' Sydney clubhouse, opening fire. 3 members were shot in the legs and torso in a ruthless, calculated attack. In retaliation, a wave of shootings, arson attacks, and ambushes followed, turning Australian streets into a war zone. But this conflict ran deeper than Orrock's defection. The Nomads and Hells Angels had been enemies for years, clashing over territory, drug operations, and outlaw dominance. One of the first major explosions of violence came in 2004 at the Newcastle clubhouse. That night, 40 Nomads from the Parramatta chapter, led by Orrock and the notorious Sam Ibrahim, stormed the Newcastle base. The result? Sergeant-at-Arms Dale Campton was shot in both knees, another member was shot in the legs, and a third was beaten and stripped of his jacket and ring in a brutal show of power. The violence spiraled further when Campton turned police informant in 2006, leading to the arrests of Orok, Ibrahim and Paul Griffin. But in 2008 they were acquitted, ensuring that the war was far from over. By 2015, police crackdowns tried to suppress the conflict, but neither club backed down. That year, 13 nomads were arrested in a raid on their Wetherill Park clubhouse. Just months later, 12 more members, including 2 high-ranking officers, were taken down on charges of soliciting mistreatment, kidnapping, blackmail, and physical harm. Among them were the Adelaide chapter president, the sergeant-at-arms, and the New South Wales vice president, proving that the war wasn't just against rivals, it was within their own ranks. Despite law enforcement pressure, arrests, and internal betrayals, the Nomads and Hell's Angels have never settled their feud. Their war has been marked by firebombings, shootouts, and high-profile betrayals, cementing their status as 2 of the most dangerous clubs in Australia.